are Christians, and among them Catholics form by far the largest group. The foundations of the church among the Igbo people were laid by an Irishman, Bishop Shanahan, in the early years of this century. His work was continued by other Irish priests and nuns, and they built up an impressive network of churches, convents and schools extending over the whole Igbo territory. Nearly all of them belonged to Bishop Shanahan's own order, the Holy Ghost Fathers, or to the sisterhood he founded to work here, the Holy Rosary Nuns. The outbreak of the war brought many problems for the missionaries. As the federal Nigerian troops advanced, the Igbo people fled in front of them, and the priests and nuns who had worked with the Igbos moved with them. Some of these displaced missionaries have since returned home, but enough have remained to ensure that all the missions and convents in Biafran-held territory are fully staffed. The emphasis of their work has changed greatly, however, and with all their schools and colleges closed, they find that most of their time is spent in bringing relief to the sick and hungry among their people. In the little village of Amimo, the Omameri girls are celebrating the feast day in their own way. Since the fall of the town of Owerri, Amimo has become the centre of administration for what is left of the Owerri diocese. Bishop Joseph Whelan, the Bishop of Owerri, moved here after the capture of the city in September, and he was joined here a few days later by the nuns from the Holy Rosary Hospital at Emakuku.
Well, I felt very happy that the nuns took the same decision that we did. They decided that it was their place to stay with the people. And even when they evacuated Emakuku Hospital, which was their first foundation in Owerri, and we called it the mother of all the churches, when they evacuated their big hospital, they came down here to Amimo, and 6 have actually remained on, 2 of whom are sister doctors. And they usefully put on their time now looking after the sick, visiting the bush, visiting the camps.
What effect has the war had on your relationship with the people here? I understand at the beginning of the war that things were rather unpleasant for the missionaries.
They were unpleasant because all white men were identified with Britain, and Britain was the enemy. But people soon began to see that we, the missionaries, were staying with our people, that we were anxious to help them, that we were a consolation to them. So they welcome us now, as you can see here today.
And also, of course, you're a provider of food.
Oh, we're our providers of food for them. We have our feeding centres, and we have helped in a big way to overcome the famine.
When you left the Diocese of Owerri, or rather the town of Owerri, you left it at a time when it was very hopeful for the future, just building your cathedral. What were the circumstances of your leaving, actually?
Well, the military circumstances were that our own army had no arms or ammunition to defend the town. So the town fell really without a shot. And our people had evacuated on the Friday and the Saturday. Sunday morning after Mass for some of the military, I left myself. And that was one of the saddest experiences of my life, because for 20 years, I have been bishop here and built up the diocese, built up a cathedral, a whole education centre, a whole centre of administration. Then in one day, it's all lost.
One of the few things salvaged from the fall of Owerri was this machine for making altar breads. The machinery was imported from Italy just before the war began and has been in continual use ever since. The war has obviously made no difference to the deep faith of the Igbo people. Working at full capacity, these girls can produce 250,000 communion hosts every month. But even at that, they only barely manage to keep pace with the needs of the Owerri diocese, and the other 4 dioceses in Biafra have to provide their own supply. The nuns from Emakuku Hospital are now living in a small house at Amimo that was once a teacher's residence. From here, the sister doctors set out each day to visit the refugee camps in the neighbourhood. In the last year, the population of Amimo has jumped from 12,000 to more than double that number, as the refugees have continued to flood into the district. The sisters, who are refugees themselves, can sympathize with their plight. Do you remember much of the journey? Was there tremendous congestion on the road?
Well, for 2 days before we left in Maputo, the refugees were on the road day and night. Cars were absolutely whizzing past all night. Then most of the refugees were travelled by foot, as they say, or on bicycles. And it was usually a man wheeling the bicycle and the baby on the back, or the mother on the back with a baby in her lap and a baby on her back. And then another baby on the handlebars. And they usually had a goat or two attached to the back of the bicycle. And that was a steady stream all along. It was just pathetic. Even some of the mothers just couldn't take the whole of their families and lost some of the children on the way, because there was a lot of bombing these few days, you see. And they would be walking along the road, and the next thing the jet would come overhead, and everybody ran for bush. And in the scurry, they often lost their children. And we got 2 of children that were just left behind like that on our way to Mimo.
And you took them here and
We
kept
took them here,
in
Father, and kept them for a while. We haven't got a hospital here now. We just do bush work. But we kept them for a while because we have a few beds in the boys' school. We keep bad patients. And when these children got a bit better, we moved them to Amigo Hospital.
So you've been completely uprooted from your hospital, and you've had to adjust to a
Absolutely,
new
Father.
kind of life. What are you doing here in
Absolutely.
Amimo?
Well, we had to form our policy when we came to Amimo, you see, because there were 6 of us, and we had been used to a very well-run hospital. We had a training school for general nurses and for midwives. And after much consultation with parish priests and the bishop and the welfare officers and the government, we decided that we would go in for social work and, village visitation in a big way. So we decided that we would first do this area of Amimo, which comprises of 5 villages, and each village has about 7 compounds, you see. And in each of these compounds, there are, anything between 600 and 1,000 people. So we decided that we would see everybody in each compound, whole families together.
The refugee camp at Ugiri is only about 4 miles from Amimo, but this is the first time that they've had a visit from a doctor. Understandably, it's not too easy to keep them in an orderly line as they await their turn to be examined.
These 2 have worm. These 2 diarrhea. These 2 cough. This one has cough and diarrhea also. This one, the skin is.
It may take several days, but Sister Doctor intends to examine every man, woman and child in the camp, taking them in family groups.
She's not feeding.
No, but we'll arrange for her to feed in the center. Give her that nurse.
There are nearly 1,000 refugees in the camp, and there's hardly one that's not in need of medical attention. The disease of kwashiorkor, which is caused by lack of protein food, is widespread, especially among the children.
Sister has swelling of the abdomen and loss of appetite and heaviness of the legs.
Where's his family?
Sister, they have all died. Yes, sister.
His wife has died?
Yes, sister. And the children.
And the children?
Sister, the children and the wife died from kwashiorkor. Oh, yeah, go on. Sister,
This man is the sole survivor of his family. His wife and children have all died from kwashiorkor, and he himself has the distended stomach and swollen legs that are a sign of the disease. Medicine by itself is of no use to him. Unless he can be given the protein food that he lacks, he will certainly die.
So come to see us nurse at the center.
Ọ sị na ị ga-abịa na senta ka ị bịa fụkwana anyị.
No,
Ngwa jere.
bring that down now to nurse.
Ngwa jere.
The refugees in this camp are from the Port Harcourt area, and somehow it adds an extra dimension of pathos to the scene when one learns many of them are professional people, teachers, bank officials, civil servants. In Port Harcourt they had comfortable homes, cars, fridges, television sets. Here at Ugiri, even the barest essentials of food, clothing and shelter are lacking. At the Holy Rosary Hospital in Ihala, the roofs of the buildings are covered with palm leaves in a not very successful attempt to hide them from passing bombers. But at least the buildings are still standing and the hospital still functions. All day long, the lorries roll up to the hospital entrance filled with new patients, wounded soldiers from the battlefield, and civilian victims of the bombing and shelling. There are no ambulances and the wounded are laid on the bare floorboards. To save precious petrol, the lorry waits until it's full before making the journey to the hospital. The long delay and the journey over rough bush roads does nothing to improve the condition of the wounded. The doctors, who are all Biafrans, work wonders under impossible conditions. There's a shortage of food, medicine and equipment. The lights in the operating theatre fade up and down when the generator runs short of fuel, and the surgical instruments are sterilized in a pot over an open fire. Yet on one night recently, 120 operations were performed in the hospital, many of them involving amputations of limbs and other major surgery. One lorry has barely finished unloading before another draws up with a new set of patients for the hospital, a new set of problems for the matron, Sister Grania.
You have a huge number of patients here. Have you enough facilities to deal? I mean, obviously in terms of wards, you don't, because they're out in the verandas.
No, they're on the verandas, they're under the beds, they're on the beds, they're every conceivable place. Even the premature nursery is now full of soldiers. Every place.
What sort of problems does this cause from the nursing point of view?
Well, it's very difficult. If you have overcrowding, it's very difficult to nurse the patients properly. I mean, for instance, doing dressings on patients under beds is very difficult. And I mean, if you have many of those, the nurses' backs are ready to break by the time they come to the end of them. And it is difficult. And
They seem to be very brave fellows. The patients themselves, or even
they are. They're very, very. I mean, they seldom complain. The only ones who complain are those who are getting better. When they're really sick, they never complain.
how are you managing to feed them?
Well, really, it's the Red Cross are responsible for that. The feeding, I must say, hasn't been all that very good. But
How do you mean hasn't been all that good?
well, they haven't been able to get the things. You see, the season, the food that they eat most is yam, and the yam season has only come in recently. And before that, when the yams were scarce, everything, they couldn't get anything instead of it. But now when they have yam, it is better. But they only get fed once a day, one meal a day.
Surely
One
it's
meal.
very hard for people to recover from sickness on that sort of diet. Huh?
It is, but what we do is we give them free milk. We get free milk in from the Caritas and French Red Cross, and we give them milk as often as we can, and stockfish.
Apart from these sort of problems of overcrowding, you have the problem of danger in terms of air raids. You see, you have a lot of camouflaging around, and you have bunkers dug here for.
Well, since the day we were bombed, I mean, everybody is more or less a bit on edge, and almost every day we have planes, enemy planes passing overhead. But
The hospital itself actually was bombed.
it was actually, it was
How did
bombed.
that happen?
It happened, it was the 4th of September. It just happened one morning about 11 o'clock. Nobody was expecting anything. We heard all right that there was an enemy plane at us below, but we never suspected for a moment that we would be bombed. And about 11 o'clock, this MiG fighter just swept over the hospital, ran 3 times and strafed, and it happened so quickly. It was all over before we realized just how much damage had been done.
How much had been done? Were people killed actually?
Oh, there were, I'd say, up to about, in the marketplace, I'd say many were killed in the market. In the hospital, not so many, maybe up to about 15, but little children were killed.
And was damage done to the wards and to the buildings?
The children's ward was the worst. Children's ward got a rocket right through the roof. There was a mother and child killed in bed. and another child was killed in another ward, and another child was cut in half up behind the kitchen.
What happened to the
Very bad.
hospital after this? How did the people react? Were they unwilling to?
Oh, that night, the morning time we had about 140 mothers and children. The night time there were 5. All had run to bush, just lifted the children, ran to bush. They were terrified. But then gradually they came in the morning and evening for feeding. They would come in for feeding and disappear again, get their medicines and go home. But now they're all back. Things are back to normal.
Day after day in Biafra, the unending search for food goes on. The village restaurants still display their grandiose names to the passers-by, but their prices have soared and their menus have shrunk almost to vanishing point. There's nothing to drink except palm wine, nothing to eat except some fruit and vegetables, and even to buy these you need a very well-filled purse.
Prices in a Biafran food market today are famine prices. Since the war, they've gone up pretty well beyond any control. A cup of this stuff, gari, which they make to use as sort of porridge, used to cost a penny a cup, now it costs a shilling. Or a yam, the staple food around here, like a big potato, used to cost 6pence each and now can cost anything from 3 shillings to £1. Or a cup of salt, which is a very important commodity in a hot climate, used to cost a penny for a little cup like this and now costs 15 shillings. Matches used to cost 2pence a box and now cost 5 shillings. Or cigarettes, when you can get them, cost 13 and 6 for 10. That's over 25 shillings for 20. A bar of soap like this used to cost a shilling before the war and now costs 25 shillings. This little heap of dried fish used to cost a penny before the war. You'd use it for flavouring or making soup. Now it costs 15 shillings. Or these lovely fellas here, a pile of snails. You could buy 30 of them for a shilling before the war, and now this lot, just 7, would cost you £1. That is if you happen to like snails. Fresh meat is pretty well unobtainable. You might be lucky to get a chicken, in which case it would cost you £4. But perhaps the most sought after of all is petrol. They call it liquid gold around here, and it costs in the black market £10 a gallon.
People still go to market, but these days they do it mainly from habit. Even if there were anything to buy, the prices would put it beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest. The market here at Nguru has an air of unreality about it, as though the real centre of action were somewhere else, and in fact, it is. About a quarter of a mile from the Nguru marketplace, there's a large convent and school, and it's here that the people come for their food, rather than to the once crowded market. The complete breakdown of the traditional system has left them entirely dependent on outside relief agencies like Caritas, the Red Cross, and the World Council of Churches. This food centre begins operating shortly after 6 each morning, and it has an average daily attendance of 3,000 women. This morning, each one is given a piece of stockfish to begin with. These dried, salted codfish are probably the most useful of all the relief foods. They are light and easy to handle, and they contain the vital protein that is lacking from the native food. The fish is followed by soup, made from vegetables bought locally. Since the Nguru Feeding Centre is administered by nuns, most of their supplies come from Caritas, the Vatican relief agency. Every night, Caritas planes break the economic blockade and fly in food, medicine and money to the airstrip at Uli. The stockfish comes in Caritas planes, and so do the vitamin tablets distributed by Sister Conrad. For the women of Nguru, the Caritas planes are quite simply a matter of life and death. Just across the road from the Women's Centre, the sisters run another food centre for children and old people. The children begin to gather here while it's still dark, and by sunrise there are up to 4,000 of them. Their little bowls and basins ready to receive their one meal of the day. Today they're getting gari, a native food made from cassava roots, and powdered milk from Ireland. The children are supposed to form orderly lines, but children are the same all over the world. And Mother Columba and her helpers are soon engulfed in a sea of bobbing brown heads. Order is not restored until it has been made quite clear to all concerned that the last scrap of Gary has been scraped from the last bucket, and that there is simply more to be had. By 9 o'clock, the children are leaving the compound, and on the road outside they meet the last of the women returning from the other feeding centre. The women are happy, but they're also keeping an eye on the sun, because they know that when the sun is fully risen, the bombers come. And the bombers are no respecters of women or children, or for that matter, of convents. A recent air raid on the convent compound, just after the people had left, wrecked the children's clinic, killing a number of children and their nurse.
Had finished the feeding. I was over at the college. I didn't know where the plane was going to drop discharge its load, but I did hear the explosion. I looked up and I heard the explosion. The convent was still there, but then towards the school, there was a cloud of smoke rising up to the sky.
This was down here.
This was down here. So I suspected immediately that it was either the church or Sister's Clinic. When I came over here, of course, everybody was running helter-skelter. The Red Cross boys the sister had in the compound, I must say, were very good. They were helping, and the home guards, several of the home guards were helping, bringing out the bodies from under the debris. Many of them, including the staff nurse, who died later on in the day, was buried under the rubble. So they dragged out 3 bodies, children, and then several others were dug up, including an infant for about 6 months who was dug up from under the rubble. But the child survived, thank God. We thought it would die, but it did not.
There is a great deal of hatred towards the Federal Army. They're called the Vandals. How do you as a sister feel towards them?
That's a hard question to answer. As a sister, well, I should not feel any hatred towards them. If I did, well, that will be just too bad. As an individual, I have no malice whatsoever against them. I feel that somehow or other, they just don't know what they are doing. There's somebody behind them. Left to themselves, they certainly wouldn't be capable of such unkindness.
Do you regard this as actually as a civil war, or do you regard it as a war of one independent state against another?
Well, for us, we don't call it a civil war. For Biafrans, it's a war of independence. We are fighting for our rights. We want to be independent because we feel that living with the others, certainly, we couldn't possibly live with them, together with them. We want them to stay together, stay on their own. We don't want to do them any harm. And if they leave us alone, that is all we want.
300 miles from Biafra, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, lies the tropical island of San Tome. It was discovered by Portuguese explorers 500 years ago, and it's remained Portuguese ever since. Nothing much else has ever happened here, and the pace of life was distinctly leisurely up to March 1968, the month when Caritas decided to make San Tome Airport the base for its relief flights into Biafra. Warehouses were rented, planes were flown in, and pilots were recruited who were willing to make the dangerous nighttime flight over hostile territory to the airstrip at Uli in Biafra. The airport in Biafra is pretty primitive. What are the problems for a pilot landing there?
Well, let's say the blackness for one thing, your lack of any reference for depth perception for getting in. The runway is so narrow that it looks longer than it really is. However, it's plenty long. It's, I think, over 7,800 feet long, but being as narrow as it is let's say, a psychological problem.
But in fact, they don't switch on the landing lights. When do they switch them on? When we were coming in, they hardly seemed to be on at all.
Well, they're not. They turn them off for every, as soon as the plane lands, the lights are turned off, and they're not turned on again until the next plane reports that he is on final. And if they don't turn them on, you don't fly the runway.
Have you experienced any of the bombing on the runways while you were down?
I was there the night of the first night air raid on the ground, but the bombs must have landed a mile or so away. It was either 4 or 6 of them, I don't know.
But some of your fellow pilots weren't so lucky.
About 2 weeks later, there was a bomb attack. One of our captains was wounded. Co-pilot was badly wounded. Father McGlade was wounded. The Red Cross man over there was wounded. And I think there was about 12 Biafrans killed. I've heard several figures. And 20 to 30 wounded.
Well, this is principally why you're so anxious to get airborne again.
Yes. So we're like offer less time per target.
How many flights in a night do you make?
You mean each individual pilot?
Mm.
Well, the normal is 2. And we've got something like, say, stockfish, something fast unloading. I have made 3.
How would this compare with the ordinary civil flying?
Well, you're pretty tired at the end of 3 shuttles because you've got an awful lot of duty time. So sitting here, waiting to be loaded, being offloaded. So say we fly maybe say 10 hours in one night, you've got 4 more hours of waiting for loading and unloading.
Are you insured?
No.
Why?
The premiums would be prohibitive.
The first plane takes off at about 5:30 Biafran time, and by the time it reaches the Nigerian coast, it's dark. The darkness poses problems for the pilot, but it also gives protection against the Nigerian anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes. The Nigerian government has consistently tried to stop the relief airlift and has accused Caritas of flying in guns and ammunition. No evidence has ever been produced for these accusations, and Caritas officials firmly deny that their planes carry anything except relief supplies to Biafra. Inside Biafra, the supplies are transported to the Caritas Distributing Centre at Ihoma. A fleet of 26 heavy lorries are waiting here to bring them to the different camps and feeding centres. All the fuel for these lorries has also to be flown in, as well as tyres, batteries and other spare parts. The distribution system is very efficient, mainly because in the missionaries it has a network of local agents who cover the whole country, who are familiar with the people and the conditions they live in, and who are able to direct the relief supplies with the minimum of delay to the places where they're most badly needed.
This is Mbutakaya, a small village on the southern zone of the Biafran war front. Mbutakaya has changed hands several times in the past few months. It's part of Biafra now, but the Federal Army is only about 3 miles away down that road, and there was continuous firing, shelling and machine gun fire last night for 4 hours, so its future is very much in the balance. Here in the Catholic Mission, there are 1,560 registered refugees, families who have left their homes in Port Harcourt and in the towns around there in front of the advancing Federal Army. They depend for their livelihood on whatever food they can obtain locally and for the relief supplies which come in from the airstrip irregularly.
It's in a place like Mbutakaya that one sees the effects of war at their grimmest. The 1,500 refugees who are staying in the school buildings have been living like hunted animals for the past 6 months. When the federal troops advance, they flee into the bush. When they retreat, days or weeks later,